on the 0 Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Now, we had an election this week, and while unusually high mail-in voting and unusually appropriate mail-in voting makes some of the counting take a little longer than it does, we already have some results, and those results, I would venture to say, suggests that it's been a very good New York and Kentucky primary for conservatives. But here to think that through and talk that through with us is our friend Sean McElwee. Sean is, of course, the co-founder and executive director of the political group Data for Progress, and he can describe better than I briefly what Data for Progress does. But they've been working on this election a lot. So without any further ado, Sean McElwee, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
And just briefly, what's a quick thumbnail description of Data for Progress?
Data for Progress is a progressive think tank and polling firm.
Good enough. Okay. See, that wasn't hard at all. I could have done that. But now let's talk about primaries. As we record this on Thursday, obviously mail-in ballots are still being counted, but was I correct in my assertion that this looks like it's been a very good primary week for progressives?
Absolutely. So the main Markey primary against incumbent was Eliot Engel against Jamal Bowman. The race really shifted when Eliot Engel was caught on a hot mic suggesting that he had only returned home during the coronavirus pandemic to his district because he was facing a primary challenge following Atlantic piece saying that he had not been in the district and in fact had not shown up to multiple coronavirus relief related events. Meanwhile, Bowman had gotten a lot of local coverage for delivering food aid to people in the district. That really set the race on fire, led to a bunch of local endorsements for Bowman. Data for Progress poll that was taken briefly after the hot mic showed Bowman with a 16-point lead. And, you know, I don't want to pat Data for Progress in the back too much, but right now he is actually a little bit above that lead. It may come down with absentee ballots, but today the Bowman campaign declared victory. The establishment pollster working for Engel had claimed that he was up by 8, which does not seem to be plausible. And I think it's really worth diving into the Engel race. Bowman was backed early by Justice Democrats who recruited him and then had sort of support consolidate closer to the election with groups like Working Families Party and Sunrise coming in. Bowman had been on the airwaves with television ads. It was an incredibly professional run campaign. They had mail, they had social, they had digital, they had local media, and was really in the driver's seat. Towards the end, the Democratic Majority for Israel, which was the famous super PAC that was set up to stop Bernie Sanders from becoming the nominee, came in with about a $3 million independent expenditure. But the Justice Democrats themselves had organized their own independent expenditure, which means that Bowman was able to keep parity on the airwaves and was able to prevent Engel from gaining an advantage by sort of having TV to himself.
So let's unpack a couple of these things, if you don't mind, Sean, because I'm very interested in the Engel race too. He's exactly the kind of Democrat that it warms my heart to see leave Congress, let's put it that way, in favor of a more progressive Democrat. How do you think, I mean, I'm asking you to speculate. Let me put it another way. Do you have a sense of how the race was going before Engel made that infamous gaffe of saying I wouldn't care if I didn't have a primary? Do you think Bowman was running strong before then? Was that a turning point, or where does that fit on the whole spectrum of events for Eliot Engel?
Absolutely. So Data for Progress was Bowman's internal pollster. And Data for Progress and myself have been flagging this race for about 2 years. Actually, the day after the November elections, I flagged Eliot Engel's district as one of those ripe for a primary challenge. Reason is twofold. One, Engel has been incredibly conservative on foreign policy, from supporting the Iraq War to opposing the Iran deal to supporting Trump's move of the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. All of this puts him outside of the mainstream of the party on foreign policy. And in fact, you saw Tommy Vitor, who was someone who worked in the Obama administration, openly supportive of the challenge against Engel because of how conservative he had been on the Iran deal. But the second thing is that the demographics of this district made it ripe for a primary challenge. It looked exactly like Massachusetts 7th, where Ayanna Pressley was famously successful, which was a very large population of African-American voters who turn out every cycle for primaries, as well as a decent portion of very liberal, college-educated white voters. And so the theory all along was that someone who could consolidate that black electorate and also make inroads with white liberals would be able to create a winning coalition, just like Pressley had done. Our early polling that was covered in The Intercept back in October showed Engel had incredibly soft support, very low name ID. And our internal polling for the Bowman campaign showed that even a little bit of messaging against Engel was enough to put the race into contention. And on the other side, the Engel negatives that they tried against Bowman, things like saying he had missed his tax payments, they just didn't really resonate with voters. For a lot of voters in that district, places like Co-op City, struggling with paying the bills and paying rent is a day-to-day experience. The other thing is Bowman has something that is always tough to find, but he has very authentic relationships with the community. He's been the principal of a school for 20 years, and that meant he came in with trust among the community that was able for him to take off. I would say that this race would have been an incredibly difficult race in any circumstance. It's always incredibly hard to beat incumbents. It was always possible, but once Engel had that hot mic moment, it was cemented. There's no amount of IEs that can fix a campaign that is getting the negative press that Engel was getting. The New York Times endorsed against him. Many of the local editorials were against him. Local politicians were even lining up against him. He was able to call in the establishment at the last moment, but right. Fundamentally, the race had shifted just so strongly against him at that point.
It's interesting. And again, we're talking to Sean McElwee of Data for Progress. It's always been my contention that gaffes don't really resonate don't typically resonate unless there's already a kind of crack in the veneer of the politician in question. In other words, if Eliot Engel had been politically in touch with his district, as progressive as his district, visited often, one of the legitimate knocks on him was that he never came to the district. He sheltered in place in Maryland, not in the district, and so on. Missed the stress and the horror unfolding there during the pandemic. But to me, what made this, my theory is that what made this gaffe resonate, his exact words were something like when they told him he couldn't speak at the rally, if I didn't have a primary, I wouldn't care. To me, you could interpret that if all the things were lined up differently as I wouldn't care about speaking. But the I wouldn't care resonated as I wouldn't even care about being here in my district. And what do you think of my theory?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's important to remember that before the gaffe, there had been an Atlantic piece suggesting that Engel had missed multiple coronavirus relief events in the district. And I think that was sort of what set the downward spiral. With any time you want to beat an incumbent, you need to have those raw demographics of the district be ready. You have to have an electorate that you can win. The second thing is you have to have the money you can spend. If you're not able to sort of get your message out there, a lot of voters aren't going to know who you are. But then the third thing is you need to get the incumbent. I don't know if you play poker, but we have the word in poker called on tilt. When someone's on tilt, they're making irrational decisions. And that's what happened with Engel, is that once he was up against the ropes and Bowman really had him there, that was the sort of the precipitation of the hot mic moment. If there hadn't already been a pre-existing narrative that Engel wasn't in the district, was missing events, the hot mic probably wouldn't have been deadly. It was the combination of the gaffe with the pre-existing fact that he was in the district. And the other thing is, and I know progressives don't find this to be particularly sexy, but the Bowman campaign had the airwaves to itself for a decent period of time after the gaffe. Engel's allies only mobilized in the last roughly 7 to 10 days of the campaign. And so Bowman was actually out there on TV, in the mail, making his message be seen by voters at that crucial moment. And I think that basically solidified the sort of race. And, if you look at our poll and you look at the results, there was really no movement towards Engel. Our number for Engel was 36%. The number that Engel is getting in the votes right now is 36%. So there was no further movement to Engel outside of the base that he already had.
So a couple other things before we move on from the Engel-Bowman race, Sean McElwee, because I find it interesting for a number of reasons. One, you talk about this, the Engel in this case being off balance and therefore gaffe prone. It strikes me that for insurgent progressives who want to primary long-term establishment Democrats, there's a lesson in that too, because it's been my perception, whether it's Lieberman challenged by Lamont in Connecticut or Crowley challenged by AOC, or we could go down a list of primary challenges. To me, it's not unusual to see Henry Waxman challenged by Marianne Williamson and then deciding to drop out of the race, which was 2012 or something. To me, there's a long-standing pattern of well-entrenched congressional or senatorial Democrats being so unused to fighting a primary challenge and so accustomed to considering the seat a sort of divine right that they do get thrown when they're challenged, and particularly if those challengers seem to be gaining ground on them, I think they get spooked. Is there a psychology here that progressives in future races should take note of?
Yeah, you're absolutely right here, which is at this point, the anti-incumbent ecosystem, if anything, has a slight technological advantage. As I said, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but our polling was more accurate than the internals that Engel had access to. I think that the mail that Jamal was producing was better than the mail Engel had. There was a sort of famously, there was a bunch of endorsements that looked like they had been produced in Microsoft Paint that Engel released. The television ads that Ocasio-Cortez ran were better than the television ads that Crowley has. Reach, which is the tool that was basically developed by engineers associated with the Ocasio-Cortez campaign, is better than the tools that they have on the establishment side. I think that the television ads, the ability to put those on the air. At this point, every primary challenger who is serious and has the backing of something like the Justice Democrats that can actually sort of come in and help them run a really professional campaign is going to be better equipped than the establishment. And I think you absolutely saw this with Eliot Engel. A lot of these folks have not had a competitive election in years.
So one last question about the Engel race. So he had this stumble, Sean McElwee. It was apparent, it was widespread, it went viral. It seemed to even symbolize what a lot of people feel about incumbents and their attitudes towards their districts. But then in the last minute attempt, as you mentioned earlier, to salvage his campaign, the Democratic establishment really came out full force for him. I mean, I can't remember all the names. I think Hillary Clinton did something, said something in favor of him. Andrew Cuomo. I can't remember who else, but it was kind of a who's who of the Democratic establishment. And as far as you could tell from your polling, that didn't change the trajectory much, did it?
No, it did not.
So is that a repudiation? Would you take that as a repudiation of the establishment's clout?
I would say yes. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if a incumbent has gotten themselves in a situation like the one Engel does, there's just no amount of sort of outside endorsements. Maybe if Obama had endorsed, maybe Biden had endorsed. But even then, I don't think it would have fundamentally changed the nature of the race. The endorsements tend to matter much more sort of at the local level where people don't have strong views of the assembly member. If someone doesn't really know who to vote for in the assembly, but they hear one person is backed by someone that they trust, maybe that'll change their minds. But most of these voters sort of knew what they were getting with Engel, and I don't think any of these establishment endorsements had real credibility with the voters. It was pretty clear that they were sort of phoning it in, and they're like, he's the establishment guy, I guess we got to back him. But I don't think you mentioned this was enthusiastic, and none of it came with any sort of resources. I don't think any of these endorsements came with sort of even like phone calls or ads, with the endorsee featured. So I think they ended up just being ignored by voters.
Let's talk about another congressional race, and this is a district that I spent part of my childhood in, and that's the race. Although it's been redistricted somewhat, my home base is in that district were Suffern, New York, and Nyack, New York, and that is the race of Mondaire Jones. And I'm not sure the exact status of the count right there with Mondaire Jones. How can you fill us in a little bit about that?
Absolutely. This is the Nita Lowey seat. Nita Lowey retired actually after facing a primary challenge from Mondaire, then became an open seat. There were four main candidates. David Carlucci, who's a former member of the IDC, which is the Independent Democratic Conference, who is a group of 8 Democratic state senators who conferenced with the Republican Party, giving the Republicans majority control of the state Senate. So very loathed by local Democratic activists. There was a fellow named Adam Schleifler, who is the son of a pharmaceutical executive, had a ton of money at his disposal, was running ads a lot in the last 2 weeks. And then Evelyn Farkas, who's a former Obama State Department official, and she was getting some money from the sort of defense establishment, even including Republican defense establishment. This one, I think a lot of people expected to be closer, and it is not close at all. Mondaire is almost at this point certain to win this race. I believe he's something like 40% of the vote, with nobody else breaking 20%. And this was a race where this is a big flex of the muscle for both Elizabeth Warren, who endorsed him very early while she was still running for president, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which made its first ever independent expenditure or buy on behalf of Mondaire. And so Mondaire is a gay, black progressive. He ran on Medicare for All, Green New Deal, even expansion of the Supreme Court. This is a very clear win for progressives, and a very clear repudiation, both of the politics of money that Adam Schleifler was sort of representative of, and the politics of sort of working with Republicans that Carlucci had. I think a lot of people thought that Carlucci would have more name ID, but at the end of the day, this is a trend we've seen actually in Kentucky as well, which is black candidates seem to be getting a lot of support from the Democratic base right now. And Mondaire also had the endorsement of the New York Times, which is very, influential in this district.
So is this also when I was a kid, it was a swing district? Is it now like Bowman's district, solidly enough Democratic that the Democratic primary winner is likely almost certain to be the next member of Congress, or is it still swing-ish?
No, there's no chance for Republicans going to hold this district.
So we've now got two likely new members of Congress who are solidly progressive, I think it's fair to say. And that raises interesting questions that I've been pondering about what, if anything, that does to the House Democratic Caucus going forward. I think in the last 2 years, we've seen a tendency on the part of House leadership to say, well, you got the squad over here, but then you've got what we call the majority makers over here, and they're more conservative. We're going to toe a more conservative line. Now, arguably, you have two additional highly progressive, and of course, the squad aren't the only four members of Congress who are progressive. You have Jayapal, you have many people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, you have Pocan, you have Ro Khanna, and so on and so on. But now the left wing of the House Democratic Caucus just got a little bigger and could arguably claim some momentum. Have you given any thought to what the implications of that might be for House Democrats?
RJ, I wouldn't be doing my job if I had it. So big takeaways here. First off, CPC early behind Mondare, put money behind him. This is really the caucus flexing muscle. It's important to remember that the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, who Mondare is a black member, they did not endorse him until 2 days before the race. They said that they weren't endorsing because there were two candidates. Everyone knew that was BS. The other black candidate in the race was regularly polling at about 1%. This was Meeks and Jeffries. They were vengeful at Mondare because he had initially entered the race as a primary challenger against Maloney in their very anti-primary. But under immense pressure, they did end up backing Mondare. But, there are a lot of members who are members of both the CBC and the CPC. For a lot of those members, ultimately, the CBC takes precedence. I don't know if that's going to be the case for Mondare because of how late the CBC ended up backing him, whereas Warren, AOC, Bernie, CPC were all there ahead of time. And we need more of those representatives who are able to sort of sit in both caucuses, but ultimately want to work with progressives at the end of the day. So I think Mondare is going to be an incredibly big asset to the progressive movement. Also, Jamal Bowman, the CBC backed his white opponent against him. So this is, again, someone who is not going to have a lot of loyalty to a caucus that opposed him, but will, I think, be much more closely aligned with the squad. Remember, Jamal was originally recruited to the race by Justice Democrats, which was the group that found and recruited AOC. So I think this is absolutely representative of a sea change. You're having more and more disproportionately younger African-American representatives who see themselves first as progressives and wedded to the progressive agenda. And, this is, I think, also a repudiation for Meeks and Jeffries, who have made the sort of rigid pro-incumbent dogma so central to their sort of theory of politics. They also lost in the 15th, where they backed Blake, and Richie Torres ended up winning. And I think they did not back Charles Booker, who's looking very good at Kentucky. So I think that they're having a problem where too often they are putting being moderate over actually representing black politicians, which is, I think, going to be a real big tension. But absolutely, the fact that open seat races are being won by out-and-out progressives, which you also saw in New Mexico's 3rd with Teresa Ledger Fernandez. I'll be watching Washington's 10th, where Beth DeLeo has Bernie Sanders' endorsement. Massachusetts 4th, the Kennedy seat, where Jesse Mermel has Ayanna Pressley's endorsement. But it is very plausible that we come out of this cycle with progressives absolutely dominating in the open seat races. And if that is the case, that means that it's going to be increasingly hard for you to have sort of moderate representatives representing safe seats like the Richie Neal seat, which is a safe Democratic seat represented by a moderate. He himself is facing a primary challenge. If every time an incumbent retires, they are being replaced by a progressive, that is going to have long-term consequences for the Democratic caucus.
And I think that you talked about the open seats, but the extent to which incumbent moderate Democrats are successfully challenged by progressive insurgents, it may also make them a little bit more defensively progressive themselves. I mean, I don't know. I guess that's speculation. Last question, because I know you got to go, Sean McElwee, but since you mentioned Booker and Kentucky, that's a Senate race, obviously. The establishment handpicked Amy McGrath, Booker's opponent in that primary. After she ran and lost a congressional race, handpicked her for the Senate because she's a veteran and so forth, I assume, and considered a moderate like themselves, threw a lot of money at her. I'm not sure when we'll know, but right now it's looking very, very good for Booker, it seems to me. And I'm not sure how she makes up the difference. But the winner will probably, either way, whoever it is, lose to McConnell. Now, obviously, if Booker gets it and beats McConnell, that'll change the landscape and the narrative when it comes to progressives running in red states. But assuming that it plays out the way it seems, I guess the good news is Booker would be Booker winning. The bad news would be an opportunity to claim that progressives can't win in red states. I don't know. In closing, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, also watch the House. Candace Valenzuela, very progressive. She has the backing of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. In fact, she's actually got the backing of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and is, I think, very well poised to win that primary. If she flips that seat, the Texas 24th seat, I think you're going to really have people have to reconsider this idea that progressives can't win. And actually, I think there's a lot of possibility of progressives making big gains in the House. In the Senate, couple key stories here. First off, Booker is African American and he has the support of the movement, groups like Sunrise. And obviously, African American politicians are surging right now, as we saw with Mondare. The other important thing to remember is Amy McGrath did not do the work. She did not have the backing of local Kentucky politicians. Booker ended up getting most of the Kentucky delegation at the state level. He got the endorsement of members of Congress representing Kentucky. Andy Beshear, the Democratic governor, stayed out of the race, and local sports radio star Matt Jones supported Booker. When I look at this race, what I see is that Amy McGrath was spending most of her time raising money from donors in California. She was running spots on Rachel Maddow. She was a titan of fundraising, but she was not doing the work to get local electeds on her side. And it became very clear when she was facing that primary, no one in the Kentucky local political scene was there to back her up. And in fact, most of them ended up backing Booker. So I think an absolute total victory for progressives there of doing the work to get a candidate with authentic local relationships. Remember, that's exactly what we saw with Jamal. That is the key to success. You want to have someone who is going to excite the African-American base, excite the liberal progressive base, but has authentic ties to the communities that they want to represent. And McGrath did not have that.
In other words, you have to do the heavy lifting of politics if you want to have a shot, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So, Sean McElwee, Executive Director of Data for Progress, thanks for all the great work you've done on some of these campaigns. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Absolutely. Have a great one.
You too. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.